Imagine this scenario unfolding. February 2025, President Trump announces sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum imports, citing national security justifications under Section 232 Trade Authority. Within 72 hours, a classified Canadian government document leaks to CBC News and The Globe and Mail simultaneously, creating immediate shockwaves across Washington and Brussels. The leaked cabinet assessment contains a single recommendation that stops Pentagon officials cold: evaluate immediate Gripen domestic production partnership with Saab AB as strategic response to demonstrated U.S. supplier unreliability through economic coercion. Canada isn't just threatening retaliatory tariffs in this scenario. They're considering building a complete Gripen fighter production facility to permanently eliminate F-35 dependence. The leaked document reveals something Pentagon never anticipated. Trump's trade war could provide the perfect political justification for Canada to do what their military leadership has quietly wanted for years: replace delayed American fighters with a faster-delivering European alternative manufactured on Canadian soil. The numbers in the assessment are stunning: $5 billion facility investment, creating 40,000 manufacturing jobs, capturing $15.6 billion in NATO export markets, and delivering operational fighters by 2027 instead of waiting until 2032 for F-35s. This scenario analysis examines how unintended consequences unfold when trade policy collides with defense procurement reality. Let me show you why this scenario is far more plausible than it initially appears, how the economic calculations actually work in Canada's favor, why 6 NATO countries would immediately follow Canada's lead, and why Pentagon strategic planners consider this exact sequence their worst-case nightmare for alliance defense-industrial relations. Because when you weaponize trade against your closest ally, they can weaponize your defense monopoly right back, permanently. The real frustrations that make this scenario plausible. To understand why this scenario works, you need to know what's actually happening with Canada's F-35 procurement right now. All of this is factual, documented reality that creates the foundation for this analysis. Canada signed their F-35 contract in December 2022 for $19 billion, expecting to strengthen Arctic air defense capabilities that have been degrading for years as their 40-year-old CF-18 fleet approaches structural retirement limits. But here's the timeline problem that's already creating documented frustration in Canadian military circles. First F-35 delivery isn't scheduled until September 2029. That's nearly 7 years after contract signature. And full Arctic operational capability won't arrive until March 2032, a full decade after payment. Meanwhile, Canadian defense analysts have documented that Gripen procurement would deliver operational capability by 2027 to 2029, providing a 3-year operational advantage during the exact period when Russian Arctic activity is intensifying and CF-18s are being pushed beyond certified service life. The only factor preventing Canada from switching has been the political sensitivity of abandoning an American defense platform and potentially damaging the bilateral relationship with their most important ally and trading partner. In this scenario, Trump's trade war eliminates that political constraint entirely. Suddenly, building domestic defense industrial capacity becomes a patriotic response to American economic coercion rather than an anti-American provocation. Real historical precedent makes this scenario pattern recognizable. In 1966, French President Charles de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command structure following sustained U.S. pressure on French economic and currency policies, using American coercion as justification to build independent French defense industries that still operate profitably today. Brazil negotiated Gripen technology transfer agreements explicitly citing technological independence from traditional suppliers when they selected Gripen over F-18 and Rafale competitors. Czech Republic's 2023 Gripen selection directly cited European production sovereignty as a primary decision factor. Canada, following the same playbook, using trade war as justification for defense industrial independence, fits this established historical pattern perfectly. By the way, if you're learning how trade wars create unintended strategic vulnerabilities that reshape alliance dynamics, hit that like button and subscribe for deep dive analysis. The secret assessment that would trigger everything. In this scenario, the leaked cabinet document reveals negotiations that were already happening before Trump's tariff announcement. This is what makes the response so devastatingly effective and impossible for Pentagon to counter. The timeline reconstruction from leaked materials would show Canadian Defense Ministry officials quietly contacting Saab AB in November 2024 for hypothetical domestic production feasibility assessment, followed by a discreet Saab delegation visit to Bombardier's Mirabel facility in Quebec during December 2024 for technical compatibility evaluation, and culminating in January 2025, private meetings between Saab CEO Mikael Johansson and Canadian Defense Minister, where preliminary production framework and investment parameters were discussed. Then February 10, 2025 arrives, and Trump announces the steel and aluminum tariffs with strong rhetoric about Canada, free-riding on American defense while undercutting our industries. And suddenly Canada has perfect political cover to announce what was already being negotiated in secret. The leaked cabinet assessment lays out the strategic logic with devastating clarity. U.S. tariff coercion demonstrates unreliability of American partnership in both economic and security domains. Gripen domestic production addresses trade war employment losses while eliminating the F-35 timeline vulnerability. Political environment now supports defense sovereignty previously considered diplomatically difficult. The investment mathematics in the leaked assessment are based on real, documented aerospace industry numbers that make the scenario economically viable. $5 billion facility investment at Bombardier's existing Mirabel site, production capacity of 24 to 30 Gripen E aircraft, annually using Saab's proven technology transfer model. Domestic production cost of $72 million per aircraft compared to $85 million for Swedish imports, saving $13 million per aircraft on Canada's 88 fighter requirement, and total job creation of 40,000 positions across direct manufacturing, 8,000, supply chain integration, 22,000, and maintenance support infrastructure, 10,000, using standard aerospace employment multipliers. These aren't speculative numbers. They're based on actual Saab technology transfer agreements with Brazil and documented Canadian aerospace industry capacity assessments. Why the export market makes this financially brilliant? Here's where this scenario becomes strategically devastating for Pentagon planners. The Canadian facility wouldn't just serve domestic requirements. It would capture massive NATO export markets that Pentagon assumed were secured for F-35. Real documented NATO procurement requirements show Poland evaluating 48 fighters with decisions expected 2025 to 2026. Romania requiring 24 fighters to replace Soviet-era MiG-21s. Bulgaria needing 16 fighters for NATO compliance. Greece considering 24 additional fighters beyond their initial 20 F-35 order. And Portugal evaluating 18 fighters for F-16 replacement. That's 130-plus aircraft totaling $15.6 billion in export revenue potential over 2026 to 2030. And every single one of these countries has cited supply chain sovereignty concerns about European dependence during their F-35 evaluation. Canadian production solves that exact concern. Suddenly, it's not European supply chain dependency. It's Western Hemisphere NATO ally production, providing sovereign supply security. The financial return calculation that makes this scenario work. $5 billion facility investment generates $1.14 billion in domestic procurement savings, $15.6 billion in NATO export revenue, and $3.5 billion in Canadian tax revenue over 8 years, producing total returns of $20.24 billion on the initial $5 billion investment. That's a 405% return on investment that any finance minister would approve. Compare this to the $8.2 billion impact that Canadian steel and aluminum industry would suffer from Trump's 25% tariffs over 4 years. And the political narrative writes itself. Canada turns Trump's trade war into 40,000 high-tech manufacturing jobs and permanent defense sovereignty. The NATO cascade Pentagon cannot stop. In this scenario, watch how quickly the dominoes fall once Canada announces the Gripen facility. This is where temporary trade pressure creates permanent strategic loss. Week 1 after announcement, Polish Defense Ministry requests urgent briefing on Canadian production timeline and export availability, publicly stating, NATO ally production addresses previous supply sovereignty concerns in our fighter evaluation. Week 2, Romanian delegation schedules visit to proposed Mirabel facility, with Defense Minister telling local media, Canadian NATO ally production provides supply security that eliminates primary objection to Gripen option. Month 1, Bulgaria and Greece both express formal procurement interest, with Greek officials specifically noting Western Hemisphere production by trusted ally changes our mixed fleet assessment for additional fighter requirements beyond our F-35 order. This creates the self-reinforcing pattern that Pentagon cannot counter through traditional diplomatic pressure. Each NATO country that expresses interest in Canadian production validates the next country's evaluation, making each subsequent decision politically easier than the previous one. Czech Republic already chose Gripen in 2023, citing European production sovereignty. Canadian production extends that logic to Western Hemisphere NATO ally sovereignty. An even stronger argument. Poland watched Czech decision closely. Now they're watching Canadian facility with even greater interest because it addresses their exact supply concerns while potentially offering faster delivery than the F-35Q that currently puts Polish deliveries in 2030 to 2032 timeframe. The strategic problem Pentagon faces in this scenario is that they cannot attack Canada's decision politically because Canada is still technically willing to maintain some F-35 relationship, just reducing dependency, not eliminating it entirely. They cannot promise F-35 timeline acceleration because Lockheed's production queue is structurally fixed by existing customer commitments and facility capacity constraints. They cannot claim Gripen is inferior because multiple NATO members have already selected it through competitive evaluation, and they cannot pressure NATO allies against using Canadian facility without appearing to oppose ally supply sovereignty, the exact principle Pentagon promotes when discussing reducing European dependence on Russian or Chinese suppliers. The irreversible transformation nobody anticipated. Here's why this scenario represents Pentagon's strategic nightmare rather than just a temporary trade dispute setback. Trade tariffs are reversible through diplomatic negotiation, but defense industrial capacity, once built and operating, becomes permanent fixture in global market regardless of future diplomatic relations. The scenario mathematics are brutal. Canadian facility operating at 24 to 30 aircraft annual production over a conservative 30-year operational lifetime produces 720 to 900 total aircraft, creates retaliation opportunities in unexpected domain. Trump's tariffs target Canadian steel and aluminum to protect American jobs. Canada responds by building defense industrial capacity that creates 40,000 Canadian jobs while capturing markets Pentagon assumed secure. Intended economic pressure becomes unintended permanent strategic loss. The market impact over time is staggering when you calculate compound effects. Documented NATO fighter requirements for 2025 to 2030 show 400-plus aircraft worth $48+ billion. Canadian facility capturing 25 to 30% market share through ally production advantage represents $12 to $14 billion immediate shift, growing to $60 to $80 billion over 30-year facility lifetime as NATO members replace current fleets. Real precedent confirms this pattern's durability. De Gaulle's 1966 response to U.S. pressure created French defense industries still operating profitably 60 years later. One strategic decision in response to temporary pressure creates permanent transformation. In this scenario, Trump's tariffs, designed to last months or years until negotiated resolution, trigger Canadian facility operating for decades, regardless of future diplomatic relations. Temporary leverage creates permanent competition. Hit subscribe for strategic scenario analysis examining how policy decisions in one domain create unintended consequences in others. Because this scenario, based on real NATO procurement dynamics, documented Canadian F-35 timeline frustrations, and actual historical patterns where economic coercion triggered permanent defense industrial independence. What happens when trade war triggers defense retaliation? Temporary economic pressure creates permanent strategic loss. Documented NATO ally production preferences become Canadian competitive advantage. $60 to $80 billion market shift over 30 years. All because trade coercion against closest ally provided political justification for move allies' military already wanted. Timeline advantage alternative with sovereign domestic production. The unintended consequence Pentagon would fear most. Weaponizing trade gets defense monopoly weaponized right back, not temporarily, permanently, for generations.